Well, thanks for coming, everybody. I'm Mark Webster. So as we mentioned in the intro, I had started a company called SaySpring, which was a voice design prototyping tool. We joined Adobe last year, and so now I'm driving voice strategy for Adobe. And I have had this thought stuck in my head for about 6 months, and so I came to curse all of you with the same thought. And if I do my job, you will walk out of here with way more questions than you have answers. And then hopefully we can answer them all together. But I think the reason my slide is crooked, is there a way to fix my slide here? There we go. PDF, who makes that? All right. The rise of conversational voice interfaces, right? It's hard to argue that we are not in the middle of a voice revolution, right? There are tens of millions of these devices out there. I think the latest stat on the number of voice assistants is something like 3.6 billion when you sort of pull together all the Android devices and the phones that have them as well. And it's huge, right? And every big tech company is putting billions of dollars into this space, and it's just been a tidal wave across sort of the digital space. And from the beginning, we've been saying sort of all the same things. And I've said many of these things since the beginning as well. That like voice is the most natural interface, right? We all know how to speak. It's the most human form of communication, right? It's how we start as babies, and then voice was going to be an opportunity to sort of get all of the visual pieces out of the way and really just get down to like what it is we want to do. And this one is my favorite. That for the first time, is there a way to fix these slides? Because I spent so much time designing these well. And you're very particular when you're at Adobe about the design of these things. And so this was, I have said this in interviews, that for the first time, devices will have to adapt to people and not the other way around, right? That we had to learn how to use a keyboard, and we had to learn how to use the mouse, and we had to learn how to use a graphic user interface. But this time, the computer is going to have to understand us because it's conversation, because this is how we all speak. But what if this isn't true? And if we look at tens of millions of speakers, people want voice, but it's still pretty much locked to like a couple of use cases, right? It's weather, it's music, it's setting timers. Who knew we all needed to set timers all the time? But apparently we did. But Adobe put out a study a couple of weeks ago, and we talked to 1,000 people who use voice devices, and 94% of them love them. And 94% of them said not only do they want more voice in their lives, but they thought that it improved the quality of their life. And that's with like 4 use cases. And so why is this thing being held back if users want it, if they think it improves the quality of their life? Why is it still only in 4 use cases? And I think one of the answers is in how we're approaching the design of these things. And so we'll go on a quick tour of my favorite term in design, skeuomorphism. So for those of you that don't know skeuomorphism, it's when you create a digital interface that mimics its real-world counterpart. And so probably the best example of skeuomorphism is we have a trash can on our desktop that we throw documents into. And so we understand what the concept of deleting is because we understand what throwing away something in the garbage can means. And all graphic user interfaces are essentially based on this when it first came out, right? So Apple in the 80s introduces the graphic user interface with that sharp-looking mouse. And it was based on the metaphor of a desktop, right? And so it was a productivity tool, and here's a desktop, and there are documents, and you store documents in folders, right? And it was this way to take people who hadn't used computers and digital devices and get it away from the command line, and then give it this graphic user interface and this metaphor that people could understand. And then when the iPhone came out 30 years later, they went right back to the well and used skeuomorphism again. And so the beginning of the iPhone, all the icons had little compasses and stock symbols and all these little real-world clues to help us understand what this thing did. And then the notes looked like a yellow pad. Games had a green felt background. The address book had that handsome leather stitching, which I thought was really classy. And the bookshelf for books, right? And it helped us understand what all these things did, and it helped us orient around that space. But then we all sort of get savvy, and we understand what it is. And then when we look back on it, it looks kind of ridiculous, and it looks juvenile. Because as we evolve and as interfaces evolve, then you have a lot more design options. And so skeuomorphism gave root to flat design. And so Jony Ive famously got rid of the glossy buttons and got rid of a lot of the skeuomorphic designs in iOS and macOS and introduced flat design. And so we already knew what a button was, so it didn't need to look like a physical button that was pushable. It could be flat. And it was also optimized around mobile. So, mobile was a small, differently powered device than desktop was. And so not having to render gradients and rounded corners, flat design was much better for that medium. And then as that evolves, it gives us more options. So material design comes along, which is Google's design approach. And it's essentially flat design, but then they use depth to give you an understanding of what are the things that you can interact with in that interface, right? So mobile doesn't have hover, so you can't sort of show hover as a signal of interactivity. So we use depth, and we use shadows, and we show how you do that stuff. But the reason all of this works is the metaphor that is behind all of these things, right? The aesthetic choices are really to just drive what the metaphor is that we're trying to get the user to understand how to wrap their brain around this interface or this app or this digital experience to understand better what it is. And so when Apple put out their iOS human guidelines in 2015 around mobile, they talked about this. And what was interesting here is that they said that these experiences should be rooted in real world or the digital world, right? That we had been around digital so long that we could now use certain concepts that we had in digital interfaces in other places within mobile, right? And so, anybody here who knows a high school student or a college student, they probably have a Chromebook. They use Google Docs for everything. The whole concept of what a file is, where a file is stored is completely changing. The whole desktop metaphor is in the middle of being completely exploded. And so if you're targeting that audience, you then now have a whole other set of metaphors to use. And so when it came to voice, everybody basically made the same decision. They said voice interfaces are people, and they have a personality, and they are delivered in a specific voice. And when there is an error message, it says, I don't understand. And jokes is apparently a thing that they're all supposed to tell us. But everybody basically coalesced around the same idea that voice interfaces are not just interfaces, they're assistants, that they're people, and that interactions are conversations. And so that every time we talk to one of these interfaces, it should feel like a conversation. And so when we talk about some of the design best practices, we talk about, well, what is the personality of the assistant of the app that you're creating, right? And what is the human-like speech? And does it introduce itself by saying hello? And our responses, things like great. And so everybody has basically said that these are conversations. And then there's nuances on top of that. So anybody who has experience working with the third-party apps on the two major assistant platforms, Amazon Alexa and Google Assistant, they've taken a different approach to how third parties interact there. So Alexa has a concept called skills. So the third-party app is a skill. And the metaphor is that you as a third party are teaching something to Alexa. And for the most part, that experience is delivered in Alexa's voice. From a design standpoint, that brings up a whole bunch of questions. When I use Alexa to check my Capital One bank account, is Alexa representing Capital One? Or is Alexa representing me to Capital One? Is she checking my bank balance and then sort of telling me what she found? How am I supposed to wrap my brain around what that is, and what does that mean for brand relationships? Google Assistant took a very different approach. They are essentially an operator. And so their third-party experiences are all delivered in a different voice. You can't access the main assistant voice as a third party. And there's a handoff. So when you say, talk to Capital One, Google's Assistant will say, here's Capital One, and then it's a different voice. And you could see why these companies would make these decisions, right? So Amazon ultimately wanted to get closer to the customer and have a closer relationship with them. And Google's essentially an advertising company and is brand friendly, right? So it's not hard to see where American Airlines would want to feel distinct in Google Assistant. And in a couple of years, when there are the ability to have more branded voices, that American Airlines would have the same voice on Google Assistant that it has when I call on the telephone, that it has in the commercials, right? And so you could see why they would take those different approaches. But in all of this, are we setting up users to fail? Because I think voice interfaces are the first time that the technology can't really deliver on the promise. For the most part, in a visual interface, and when you use skeuomorphic design, it's really an aesthetic approach, right? So you are using green felt, and you're using wood grain, and you're using handsome leather stitching. But for the most part, the interactivity doesn't really change too much. But when it comes to conversation and how we deliver those conversations, can these machines and can these interfaces really deliver on that? Are we just setting people up with this promise of this ease and utility that we can't really deliver on? Because when we look at the voice revolution, basically a couple of the reason this sort of kicked off in 2015, there were a few different pieces, right? So the first was there were major advances in speech recognition, right? So if anyone's read the book AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, he talks about that there has really only been one major advancement in the last 20 years in AI, and that was deep learning. And then every time we read about AI, it's really applying deep learning to something else. And so it turned out that deep learning and machine learning was really, really good to apply to speech recognition, right? And if you look at the chart of speech recognition, it was going like this for a bunch of years, and then around 2012 it just spiked, and now we're at 96, 97%. And human transcription is 95, 96%, right? So we're really, really good at it. But, and there was the change in form factor, right? And so we also got way better microphones in devices like smart speakers. And so when we were all introduced to voice was probably Siri coming out in 2011. And we were told that Siri could do anything, which wasn't true. And it was on a phone, so we already had the screen in front of us. And it was through a microphone, one mic that would be on a phone. And then the form factor of the smart speaker came out, and it has 7 unidirectional mics on it. And Amazon very smartly said, this thing does 4 things really, really well. And it did, and it delivered on that promise, and it was magic. And now, since then, we've basically been trying to advance how much it can do. But the AI and the ML part is still limited. NLP and understanding intent, understanding what a user is trying to do and how we separate out all of that stuff from the phrase of here are the slots, right? I want a car. The car and the destination are things we need to pull out. Understanding conversation is really, really hard. And I think actual conversations with machines are pretty far away. There's probably few people in this room that would argue that we're at least 5 or 10 years from being able to have a real conversation with a person. But if I'm truly being honest, I don't think I'm going to see that in my lifetime. And I'm 40 years old, right? We're in New York. This is the sarcasm capital of the world. You are literally meaning the opposite of the thing you're saying. Conversation is super regional and cultural, and there's different dialects depending upon which part of the country you're from. And I don't see how machines can actually understand people the way another human being will understand somebody. But I also don't think that that's a limiting factor. Because I think that we need to think of voice like an interface, not as a person. And I think like all interfaces, voice needs to be intentionally designed. And we need to think about who is the user and what are they trying to do, and then what's the right process to find that solution for that person. And there's a lot of stuff that voice is going to do really well, and there's other stuff that voice doesn't do as well. And we need to embrace those constraints, and we need to not continue to try and deliver a promise to a user that we can't fulfill. And we need to embrace those constraints and find the places. Think of speech recognition as a new tool in our toolkit that we as designers and creators and developers can use in our digital experiences when it makes sense. To bring a totally ridiculous example into this, in the World's Fair in the early 1900s, when everyone was doing laundry manually, there was this vision of having machines do our laundry. And the way we all thought about it was a humanoid robot doing our laundry, right? And it's the promise of Rosie from the Jetsons was going to make our life really easy. But it turns out that like a washing machine is the right solution to that. And there's a lot of stuff washing machines don't do or do horribly. We still have to separate clothes, which is ridiculous. We still have to fold them. Nobody solved that, and I don't know why. And then when we look at something even like a dishwasher, we all had visions of like a robot dishwasher. A robot butler was going to wash the dishes. But it turns out that you put it in the rack, and you still have to rinse it off. But it's better than the alternative. It's better than not doing it that way, and the convenience that those solutions bring to the table is still worth having it. So a system can have weak points, but we have to understand those weak points, and we have to embrace those constraints. And we have to find the right mental model to build it off of. The right mental model for dishwashing was not a robot that was going to wash it. And when we think about what voice is, and we think about how users should understand what that mental model is, I don't think we've cracked it yet. I think there are places where maybe an assistant is the right approach, but there are going to be plenty of others where it's not. So I always think of the example of a hospital room, right? Maybe having a voice interface in a hospital room for the patient that feels like an assistant that you could talk to call a nurse or adjust the bed or change the channel is the right one. But if a nurse comes in and she just wants to take notes, those notes are just going to be really quick keywords just to rattle off, right? Nobody is going to want to have a conversation with an interface in order to take those notes. So understanding the user and the context is super important. Because when we get it wrong, we really get it wrong. Everybody thought that flight was going to be us mimicking a bird, and it turned out that you just need to shoot fire out of the back of a silver tube, and that's the solution. So we need to be more pragmatic about how we think of voice, and think about how are we just shooting fire out of a silver tube when we need to. Just to dig into another example of this, so anybody who's worked with Alexa skills, either using them, building them, designing for them, welcome to Skill Name. It's like how every single skill starts. And it could be that we all went through a rigorous design process, and we asked ourselves hard questions like, what is the user's mental model when they're using a third-party app on Alexa? Are they entering a space like Walmart where they're going to be greeted, and then they're going to go to the next location to find the thing that they're looking for? Is this a counter that they're going to, and somebody is going to go then fetch them all the things that they need? Or did everybody go to GitHub and pull off the template for like a quiz game because it was similar to the thing you wanted to build, and it said welcome to quiz game, and you changed quiz game to the name of your app, and that's why it says welcome to? Because I'm going to guess that it's definitely that last thing, and nobody really put thought into why that's the thing. And so we are just going ahead with this like implementation-driven, developer-driven solution, and then when we apply design to it, we tend to apply design afterwards. So we look at, here's this functional skeletal version of how this whole thing works, and then a designer comes in and adds like great and hello, and like that's how we make it more human. But what we've seen over the last 10 years in all other digital interface design is that it needs to start with design, not implementation. And now I have the great privilege at being at Adobe, and Adobe has the answer to creating great user interfaces. And it's empowering creatives. That it is literally just giving people access to mediums and giving them the tools to go answer those questions. Because it's really hard to just define what this is all going to be, right? And all the big tech companies are trying to do that. They say, well, here are the best practices. But I don't even think we know the best practices. And I think the best practices are going to come from the creative community. And I think it's going to be people trying out different things, and all the good stuff will bubble up to the top, and then we can all steal that best stuff and just put it into our stuff. Right? And so Adobe XD is a tool that we have at Adobe, which is for design and prototyping, mobile apps and visual interfaces. And so last October, we introduced voice functionality into the prototyping so that you could give designers access to the medium of voice in order to think about what those experiences are. It is in no way a bot builder. You will never have a button that says click to publish at the end of it. Much like we've done in visual design, it's ultimately a creative storytelling tool in order for people to understand what the right experience is and coalesce around that as a team, whether it's the client and the agency or internally at a company, and then started the implementation once you understand what that user experience is going to be. And so we also recently did a big Amazon Alexa integration, so now you can talk to your prototypes through Amazon Alexa. And again, it's really just to simulate that environment so that you can understand what that experience is going to be before you invest more in actually building this and launching this and getting it in people's hands. Because that's what we've been doing in the creative community in digital interface design for the last 10, 20 years, right? You have to explore different concepts, you have to design them, put them in front of people, listen to it, iterate. And as we do that over time, then we have the ability to standardize the stuff that works. And so when it comes to voice, I think we need to start from scratch. Anybody who was at the Voice Summit a couple of weeks ago, somebody from Samsung stood up and talked about how, we had a decade that was defined by the web, and we had a decade that was defined by mobile, and the belief that now we're entering a decade that was going to be defined by voice assistants. And I was like, I think it's voice, but I don't think it's assistance. Like, you're already deciding that there's this whole other thing we figured out, which I don't think we figured out. And so I think we need to start from scratch on all this. And we really need to think deeply about what is voice and what is it good for, and where do we bring it into all digital experiences? When is an assistant a right metaphor and when is it not? But let's not assume we figured anything out. Voice is an interface first, right? It is a means to input, and then speech and audio playback is a means of output. And so let's think about how we use that in places it makes sense, right? And thinking about the audio piece is super important, right? Even when we throw something away in the garbage can, it makes a crumbled sound, right? If you're thinking of a conversation, there's no nonverbal audio that's part of conversation, right? If we ultimately think of it as an interface, we can be a lot more creative about how we use the input and output to create better digital experiences. Because if we do that, we can establish UI and UX convention. Every single time you open an Alexa app or a Google Assistant action, you have no idea what you're walking into. You have no idea what it's capable of. You have no idea how to navigate it. There's no idea of consistency in any of this stuff. Any of us could open an e-commerce app or website and go through it and understand exactly what we're going to see on every other screen. When we ask for address information, we always ask for it in the same way, right? Even when we say phone numbers, we all say it the same way because we're picturing, the parentheses around the first three and the dash in between the other seven, right? When there's consistency, the way that you can interact with stuff completely changes, and voice has none of it, all right? When we think of digital interfaces, we have all these tricks of the trade, right? We have pull down to refresh, we have buttons versus links, we have collapsible menus, and pull down to refresh is a great one. So pull down to refresh started because an independent creator created a third-party Twitter app and put in pull down to refresh as a way to refresh the page. And then Twitter was like, well, that's genius. I should buy your company and you should come work here, and they did. And then Twitter implemented it, and then everybody was like, this is a really good thing, and then Facebook introduced it. And then it's now in everything, Chrome and Safari on the mobile all have it, right? And so this is the way it's going to work. What's going to work is if we try lots of different things, we'll find the right stuff, it bubbles up to the top, and then it becomes standardized. Because the important part is to get that consistency, is to create a believable environment for users. So this is also from Apple's Human Interface Guidelines, but this is from 1987, when we were all new to what digital interfaces were going to be. Because they believed that we needed this transfer of skills, that when you went from one app to the other, when you went from one digital environment to the next, you knew what to do. And if we're telling users that voice interfaces are conversations, are we creating a believable environment? Does that feel like a conversation, right? Are we just, again, setting people up to fail by doing that? So let's pull it all back and let's look at the way we've done digital design in other places and bring that to voice. So let's put the user first. Let's think really hard about what the right mental model is, and those mental models are going to change. This is not saying assistants don't make sense. This is saying it's not one size fits all, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff we need to figure out. And let's look at what we've learned about successful patterns in other digital interfaces and bring it here. When was the last time you had onboarding in any voice experience? Never. It's just people starting with hello. And when you put an onboarding experience into mobile apps, it makes a huge dent in retention. And so maybe it turns out that voice has more friction up front because you need to sort of get to know the voice interface and what it's capable of, and then once you do, it's way more convenient. And there's a whole bunch of places where people will make that trade-off. Maybe it's not just consumer apps, but maybe it's a lot of enterprise applications. If anyone here has ever learned how to use Salesforce, it's horrible, but you still need to use it. And so when we could use voice to make updating a Salesforce record in your car when you go from customer to customer a much more pleasant experience, somebody's going to invest the time to learn how to use that. And let's consider alternative approaches, right? So just to show you 2 examples of where somebody used voice in a really smart, clever experience that wasn't an assistant and that wasn't an Alexa app. So anybody who uses the Spotify mobile experience, about a year and change ago, they leaned in really heavily into voice as part of the search experience. You're not talking to Spotify. It doesn't respond with any speech back to you. There's no Spotify assistant. It is just when you go to search, there's a very prominent microphone, and they know that you're going to have voice as part of the experience of listening to music lots of times through smart speakers. So let's start to make those experiences feel more consistent, and let's use voice as a way to find music in mobile as well. But it doesn't need to be an assistant, and it doesn't even need to have speech as part of that response. And anyone who saw the WWDC announcement about the new macOS iOS Catalina, Apple introduced an accessibility feature called voice control. And so right now they're very targeted on accessibility and making sure that these digital interfaces are available to people with mobility issues. But they're really clever approaches to what they did here. So just to point out 2 really quickly. So in Mac OS, there's a whole grid system that you could say show grid, and it brings up a grid so that you can pinpoint specific places on the interface to drill down into. And those grids can be on the main screen or they can be within apps. So the idea of how do you navigate around a space without use of a mouse was a really clever implementation of it. And then it also brought it into iOS. And so one of the things they do is you could say show numbers, and it brings up a number next to every single interactive element on the screen, and then you could say that number. Right? It was really clever. They didn't make this about Siri. They didn't think Siri was the way to make these devices more accessible. They started from scratch, and they came up with a really novel solution. And I actually think what we're seeing here is the beginning of a different way of interacting with digital interfaces through voice. And I think this looks like an accessibility feature initially, but I think there's a lot of promise here, because maybe this whole thing should be about we're talking to apps. Right? Like the mental model is, I know what Spotify looks like because I use it all the time. I understand those screens, I know what those 3 icons along the bottom are, and I could probably navigate it with my eyes closed through voice. And so maybe instead of my eyes being closed, my phone's just in my pocket, and I'm activating it through my AirPods, but I'm basically talking to the Spotify app. Like maybe that's the right mental model. We don't know, and I don't know. But I think we need to think smartly about what the alternatives could be. And I do know, because we've seen this plenty of times, that when you start a project with a weak design approach, everything else you do is a waste of time. And this doesn't need to mean you need to be a designer. You could still be a developer and think about the core principles of design and how you bring that into making sure that the thing that you're going to invest hours into building makes sense. But let's think about what it is we're doing. And I'm going to leave you with one parting thought here. The mobile revolution. So we all talk about the iPhone moment and how it exploded mobile. There's lots of comparisons to the Amazon Echo and smart speakers and the iPhone. Mary Meeker likes to put together her charts that shows the sales of smart speakers are outpacing iPhones. It's going to be even bigger. But the iPhone was a moment in time, because the mobile revolution was actually a really long time coming. There was a lot to figure out before we got to the iPhone. First, there was just mobile phone calls. We needed to figure that out, and we had to carry around those big suitcases. And then we had the Palm Pilot, which was not connected, but brought a whole bunch of smart features to us. There was the Newton, which had voice control and was really, really terrible. Then there was the first smartphone, and then there was the BlackBerry. And the BlackBerry really, if you know anybody who had a BlackBerry, they loved their BlackBerry. They called it the Crackberry. And it was amazing, and I think this is the picture I grabbed here is like version 3, where they introduced a little thumb pad. So now you could navigate around the screen with the thumb pad. And it's like, this is mobile. And then the iPhone came along, and that other thing seemed ridiculous. And a whole bunch of people were like, this will never work without a physical keyboard. The head of design for IDEO was like, people need the tactile feedback of a physical keyboard in order to do it. And Steve Ballmer famously said, the iPhone is a terrible email machine. We'll fail in the enterprise and nobody will use it. But we saw what happened, and we saw how it changed everything. So maybe the Amazon Echo isn't the iPhone. Maybe we're just at the BlackBerry moment. Maybe we've proven enough of what people want, but we just haven't figured out the touchscreen equivalent. We haven't figured out the framework of pinch to zoom. Like there's just core pieces of that experience we haven't unlocked yet. And we're close, but maybe we're just not there yet. And maybe I'm all wrong. So maybe everything I said was super wrong. And maybe you're gonna, in a couple of years, be like, I once saw this guy talk about we should bring back like phone keyword systems and like IVR systems, and like that was gonna be the future. But I don't think I'm wrong. And I am pretty confident of one thing, that the thing that is gonna unlock voice and the thing that's gonna set this all free is design. So thanks for coming.
All right, we're going to take a few questions, so we're going to run the mic around the room.
You want to do questions? That'd be great.
Yep.
Oh, just a comment that Apple voice control was literally from Blade Runner.
It's magic. It is totally magic. There is actually...
I mean, it is in the movie Blade Runner as done by that.
Perfect.
That's the way it was done.
Nice.
Grid.
Very cool. Okay, walking over.
Sci-fi always gets it right like 20 years before it comes out.
Hi, also about voice control. First of all, great talk. Thank you very much. Voice control, I worked at Dragon 20 years ago, and we put that in. And it actually was really successful, but for people with repetitive strain injury, other disabilities. But when somebody had access to their hands, the value in that use case just wasn't there. So, I mean, I do hope that we do find a larger audience for that. But the early data from that time was that it didn't really catch on. We're in a different time now, so it might be different, but that's the way it was then.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned around designing for accessibility, right? And so if you think of the ADA comes out and says that, you know, for wheelchair access, we need to put a ramp in every corner of a sidewalk, right? What that also does is it makes it easier for people with rolling suitcases and strollers and elderly people who don't have to take a full step up. Like when you design around accessibility and when you design for different populations, you actually create better solutions for everybody, right? And I actually think that when you look at a lot of the way people use Dragon and when you look at speech readers too, right? One of the big lessons that sticks in my head is if you go to YouTube and you look at a couple of videos around people using screen readers. The longer somebody's used a screen reader, the more they turn up the speed that it speaks back at, to the point where it is like a blur that you can't understand, but that's what they want, right? And so interfaces, the voice interfaces, maybe they're not conversations, maybe they're just a means to get that information. And 3 weeks ago, Amazon introduced the ability to slow down or speed up Alexa's voice. And so as New Yorkers, I know you're all gonna go make it speed up, as you should. But I think like looking at sort of how those things have been, I mean, I think we are at a very different time in voice and devices and user behavior. And so I think it's interesting to look back at those things and see what lessons are to be learned.
Hey, Mark, really enjoyed your talk tonight, so
Thank you.
Thanks for that. So do you think today that there are any voice design conventions that work well and that are broadly used? Or do you think that we really need to just start from scratch?
I think there are certain things that, I mean, so there are certain conventions that work, right? So the generalized assistant metaphor has worked really well to onboard general users into basic functions, right? So not that my mom is a basic user, but she has an Amazon Echo device. She's a very basic user. And she uses it for timers and time and music and everything else. And she's never opened Spotify on a digital interface, and she still has a not smartphone. So it was very good at that, right? And so they did get a lot right, and has definitely made it general purpose. And it's wildly successful. But I think what's happening is like everybody's just looking at that and being like, well, then that's how you do it, right? And I think one reason to think about breaking out of conversation is it opens up the ability to use other forms of audio in experiences, right? So if anybody here has AirPods, right? AirPods never talk to you, but when you put them in your ear, you hear the sound of them connecting. When the battery starts to die, you hear the whoop, whoop, whoop. And it's not region specific, and it feels very emotional and human. Like we know what it means. No one ever told us what any of that stuff meant, and we figured it all out. I have another pair of Bluetooth headphones, Plantronics, that when I connect it, it says connected. And then one says battery low, battery charged. And so that is, one, not a very pleasant experience, right? And it's definitely going to have to change for different markets, right? And so like there's an example of thinking about once you break out of the conversational approach, that you can then start to think about how you just use it as a form of input or output and maybe come up with better solutions than it just talking back to you.
Sorry to interrupt, I'll pass it over. Thanks for the speech. I had a question. So in our implementations, we typically bring in the design team initially, but for our large Fortune companies, they have a legal department that'll push back, or a marketing department that'll say, we need an omni-channel experience, so you need to add this phrasing that's off the website or off, the chatbot or the website, and then legal will say, well, you need to preface it with this phrasing, and so we push back, we explain like all the terms and the challenge of the customer experience. How have you successfully convinced these types of clients, whether they're internal or external, to, focus on the customer experience over essentially expanding what they've already done?
Yeah, so nothing you said there involved voice, right? Like that's just like the bane of digital design, right? And anyone who's
Voice
been
is the
involved,
worst. If they,
right,
you have a chatbot and then they have to read out
Yep.
the entire part of the chatbot.
It's new and it's different, right? Every time you design any digital experience, especially in a big company, there's stakeholders, there's legal messing everything up. I remember when I started my career at the NBA, and in like 2003, we redesigned NBA.com, and every single department needed to be in the primary nav. And we were trying to tell community relations of like, most people don't come to NBA.com to look at community relations. And there's not really room in the primary nav. So like those things always come up, right? And I think there's a lot about voice that feels new, but these are the same challenges that we've been dealing with for a long time, right? The entire reason Adobe as a company exists is because figuring out design is hard. And we constantly talk about voice interfaces, and we're like, in digital design, visual design, you have buttons to use, and you could show people what their options are, and it's like, you talk about it like it's so figured out and easy, and like every single project is like starting from scratch and like using Adobe XD and creating prototypes and getting feedback. So, there's always going to be challenges in that. The challenges of voice are new, right, nuanced. If I had the answer of how to fix that, I'd probably be the richest man in the world.
All right, one last question.
I don't know if this is really a well-formed question, but it's sort of, would love to get your thoughts on like how the idea of voice has evolved, especially the voice of the assistants. Like Duplex is an example where it's like everybody's really excited because it seems really human. But like, Star Wars voices of the robots, those weren't human voices, but people really loved those. So what are your thoughts on possibly like ditching the human aspect of the voice and coming up with a voice that's like something that people can love, that they know is not human, that will drive their expectations a little bit?
So I don't know if everyone here is familiar with the Google Duplex. So Google Duplex did a demo on stage where they had the assistant call a human being and like make an appointment. And it said and it said and it went through the awkward flow of booking an appointment, and it worked. And I actually think that trying to convince the other person on the phone that it's a human is a horrible design choice, and like adds a ton of friction. Because if that person whose job it is to take appointments knows that the Google service calls and they understand the flow of questions, by the third time they get one of those calls, they're just going to fly through it, and they're not even going to wait for it to speak, right? When we all call into conference calls, we don't wait to hear a star and the number, and like we just enter it all and we skip it all, right? And like that's where we want to get to. Like we understand how to use that interface. So Duplex is a great example of when we make it human, it makes it worse. Whether or not the voice needs to feel robotic, I don't know if that feels as important as long as the user understands what that experience is. Using a robotic voice could be a helpful way to get that person to understand that it's not a human being. But maybe the experience of just going through it once or twice, because you're always going to be talking to somebody who's going to be going through that experience often, is enough.